Year of Learning by Dr. Paul Koenigsberg. In memory of his brother, Dr. Sam Koenigsberg, Shimon Reuven ben Leibush, and Ed Goldberg's cousin, Nissen Hara Nissen ben Fardosa. Paula and Bob Bromberg, in memory of their dear friend Julian Smith, Yehuda ben Yisrael. Malka Mann, in memory of her family murdered in the Holocaust. Harav Tzvi Hirsch ben Shlomo Yaakov, Sarah bat Ephraim, Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Ephraim ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Adia bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Miriam bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Pesel ben Harav bat Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shalom ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shlomo Yaakov ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shmuel ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. The many friends of Dr. Marvin Blush, Moshe Shalom ben Yitzchak Halevi, friends of Toby Paris, Sarah Tova bat Yisrael Dov, friends of Malka Levi, Malka bat Yosef, friends of Avi Gitler, Avram Meir ben Shimon, Cheryl Sher, her children and grandchildren, in memory of her uncle, founding member of BRS, Dr. Israel Brook, Yisrael ben Harav Akiva, Marcia Federbush and family, in memory of her husband, Dr. Oriel Paul Federbush, Oriel ben Harav Shimon. A Month of Learning by Haran and Mel Haller, in memory of her mother, Malka Rachel Bas Yehuda Leib, Adina and Michael Kirshner, in memory of their parents, Florence and Nathan Kirshner, and friend Harriet Friedman. Tova and Leo Zimmer, in memory of her mother, Henya Bas Rav Beryl, and her father, Aaron ben Yosef Mordechai. Perry and Jill Meltzer, in memory of his mother, Malka Bas Baruch, and his sister, Goldalea Bas David Halevi. Carol and Josh Sanborn, in memory of her father, Yoshua Shia ben Moshe Yehuda HaKohen. Today, a day of learning plus Torah Fund, sponsored by Marvin and Shirley Weinstein, in memory of his late wife, Ita Bat Avraham, by Stan and B. Monsowitz, also Day of Learning plus Torah Fund, in memory of his mother, Rachel Bas Herschel Mordechai. Today, a Day of Learning also by Judy and Ari Cohen, in memory of their friend Anita Weinstein, as well as by Bob and Judy Thaler, in memory of his brother Avram Yechiel Michel ben David Eliyahu. May the Shemas have an Aliyah, Krank Rafia, Velti Yashir Hashem Matzliah, L'chol B'nai Israel, a good Gebencht Yar. Okay, that is it for today. Today is also Martin Luther King Day. So at least the efforts he made for welfare of all communities. Okay, we are on Nun Chet Amud Aleph, a new parak, a new topic. I indicated at the end yesterday that we were now going to deal with the, hi Mandy, with the area of the Korban Pesach. Okay, now just a very short intro and then we'll go into the text. Hopefully that will give some of the other guys a chance to get on. Normally we would have thought, right? If we're dealing with Korban Pesach, okay, we would deal with the question of following. When should the animal be segregated, for example? At what point should the animal, might it question what happens if the animal has a mum? Okay, does that mean it cannot be used? And therefore, does it make it similar to other korbanos or not? If that's the case, if we're going to say it's similar to other korbanos, how is it similar? Okay, or how is it different? Okay, that would be another example. We see that every day, by the way, in the Siddur. If we read the section of korbanos in the Siddur, okay, towards the end of that section, if I remember it correctly, it says, okay, Habachor v'Maser v'Pesach Kodeshim Kalim. Okay, it then goes on, and then it says, HaPesach eino ne'achal ela b'layla, ve'eino ne'achal ela ad chatzot, ve'eino ne'achal ela l'minuyah, ve'eino ne'achal ela tzli. Okay, so we might have assumed that some of those items would be raised, okay, in this discussion. And maybe we will see it eventually as we go through this parak. But the parak begins with a discussion of the fact that we already have an existing, what I'll call format, okay, in the order of karbanos based on the Tamid, right? And therefore, the question that's initially presented is, so where then do we do the Pesach? If we've got set times for the Tamid, how does the Pesach then fit in? Okay, so that's what I'm going to suggest, is the fact that perhaps we'll deal with some of the other unique aspects of Korban Pesach, but here initially we're starting off with not when it is to be taken, selected, okay, because remember it was supposed to be taken and tied separately, but its association with Korban Tamid. So our Mishnah begins, Tamid nishchat b'shmona umechza, that we have the idea that we have two, okay, occasions for Korban Tamid, one in the morning, one in the evening. And notice we indicate that the evening is done at, or let's say afternoon, it's done, the second one of the day is done at 8.5 hours into the day. Now we're assuming that, first of all, these are sha'ot zmaniot, temporary or flexible hours, okay? And that it's based on the amount of daylight, right. Okay, number one. Number two, that it's also based on the idea that these flexible hours are going to vary from the summer versus the winter, the amount of daylight. And so therefore we're going to have to say that when it says 8.5 hours, okay, if we're using, let's say, an approximate time of a day from 6 in the morning till 6 at night, we're talking 2.5 hours after midday. Okay? So therefore, the Gemara then, the Mishnah continues. Okay? So from 2.5 hours, theoretically, let's say 2:30 in the afternoon onward, one could perform the Tamid. V'karev b'tisha of mechze. But the Gemara then says, but it's not, that's when it's slaughtered, but when is it brought on the altar? At 9.5 hours. So there's an hour there. Okay, says the Mishnah. Okay, so what happens during that hour? Right? Are we going to assume that that's involved in the normal 4 avodot, okay, which we said Art Scroll introduces in some detail, but quickly to point out, maybe besides the shechita, is it a question that it takes an hour to do the Kabbalah, the bringing of the blood, the halacha, the conveying to the altar, and the zrika, and the spritzing of the blood on the altar? Okay? We don't have any answer here. Nevertheless, the Mishnah continues. Ba'arve Pesachim, okay, on the eve of Pesach, on the 14th of Nisan, nishchat b'sheva umechza. It is slaughtered at 7.5 hours. So in other words, at that particular day, we change the time of the tamid, it seems, to slaughter it at 7.5 hours. V'karev b'shmona umechza. And it's offered at 8.5 hours. Okay? Now, why the hour earlier? Well, maybe the point is that there's so many korbanot Pesach, okay, that we say that that's going to have that time after the tamid. But normally we know that things are not done after the tamid. So we have a problem. Bein b'chol, bein b'shabbat. And the Mishnah would seem to say that we have that adjustment of an hour regardless of whether Erev Pesach comes out on a weekday or on Erev Shabbos. Now, okay, furthermore, Chal Erev Pesach liot be'erev Shabbos. If we now see, says this Mishnah, that Erev Pesach comes out Friday afternoon, okay, what do we do then? Okay, so it's one thing if it comes out on Shabbos, on a weekday, or on Shabbos itself. In other words, Saturday night. Okay, but what about if it comes out Friday night? Right? Now says the Gemara Mishnah, Nishchat b'sheishu mechza. We slaughter it 6.5 hours. In other words, 2 hours earlier than usual. V'karev b'sheva umechza. Okay? And then we bring it on the altar at 7.5 hours. So again, it's 2 hours earlier. V'hapesach acharav. Okay, and then we do the Pesach after it. So does that seem to imply that the Pesach is normally done after the tamid? Or does that seem to imply that the Pesach is only done after the tamid when it occurs on Erev Shabbos? And otherwise, maybe the Pesach would be done before the tamid on other occasions. These are questions that come up. Gemara, Minahani Mili. Okay, so we now get to our Gemara.
How do we know all this?
Okay, on what basis is this, asks the Gemara. So we see the first attempt to explain the Mishnah by Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, the Amar Kra, according to the Pasuk, at the keves echad ta'aseh baboker, ve'et keves hasheni ta'aseh bein ha'arbayim. Citing the basic Pasuk, that first of all tells us we have two korbanot tamid, one in the morning, okay, baboker, and one bein ha'arbayim. Now, what does that mean? Between the evenings, chelkehu levein shnei aravim. This is Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi. They divided it between 2 evenings. Okay? So how do we get 2 evenings? Shtei sha'ot umechza lekan. He says there are 2.5 hours here. In other words, 2.5 hours after midday, Ushtei sha'ot umechza lekan, and 2.5 hours later before sunset or dark. Okay, so that would be the time after the first 2.5 hours, but before the later 2.5 hours, implying that we have basically roughly 5 hours from midday, approximately, to sunset. V'sha'a achat la'asiyato. And 1 hour, okay, that slot between. So that's what give us then 6 hours between midday and 6, if we're guessing using that model of 6 to 6. Okay? So that's Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's view. Okay? And what's important as we see here, okay, right, that is he bases it on the pasuk. Now, Meitiv Rava. Rava challenges him with the following. Ba'arve Pesachim, okay, according to our Mishnah, says Rava, on the eve of Pesach, Nishchat b'sheva umechza, it's slaughtered 7.5 hours. V'karev b'shmona umechza, and it's brought on the altar 8.5 hours. That was Tanakama, so to speak, second phrase in our Mishnah. Bein b'chol, bein b'shabbat, regardless if it's on a weekday or if it's on Shabbos. Therefore, Rava continues, V'isa gadatach, and if you want to consider and say, b'shmona umechza deoraita, that when we say, okay, that it's 8.5 hours is Torah mandated, hechi makdinenle, how is it possible for us to make it earlier? Right? Because it said you make it, we just read, we make it an hour earlier then. Ela amar Rava. Says Rava, this is the way we have to understand our Mishnah. Mitzvato de tamid, mishenitu tzlalei erev. That the mitzvah of doing the korban tamid occurs when I'm going to call the lengthening of the shadows at night. In other words, the evening shadows slant toward the east at night. In other words, after midday, right, the shadows of the sun start moving in a
west
direction, okay, toward the east. My tama da amakra bein ha'arbayim. So therefore, what is the reason that the verse says, okay, between the evenings, me'idna de matchil shimsha lema'arev. From now, from the time that the sun begins to move towards the west. Hilkach, b'shar yemot hashana. Therefore, in the other days of the year, de'ika nidarim unidavot, okay, where there are other korbanos, namely voluntary offerings and vows and things like that. The Rachmana Amar, that according to the Torah it says, Aleh chelvei hashlamim, all these other voluntary offerings, shlamim. Okay, when are they to be done then? V'amar ma, and as the master says, Aleh chelvei shlamim, namely, okay, Aleh hashlem kol hakorbanot kulan, that upon it, okay, will be fulfilled all the other offerings, namely, ma'achrinan le tarte shai, and that therefore we put them off, make them later 2 hours, vavdinan le b'shmona umechza, and we do them at the 8.5 hour, after 8.5 hours. Now, Gemara continues. Ba'arve Pesachim, the Ika Pesach Acharav. But on the eve of Pesach, okay, where we have the Pesach after them, Kadminim le Sha'a Achat, that we make these earlier 1 hour, Va'avdinim le B'sheva umechza, and therefore that's why we do it at 7.5 hours. Chal Erev Pesach liot Erev Shabbat. And when we have an occasion where Erev Pesach falls out on Friday afternoon, okay? De'ikanami tzliato delo dache Shabbat, where we also have to do the roasting of the Korban Pesach, which does not, okay, put off Shabbos. In other words, it can't be done on Shabbos. Mokminan le adine b'sheish umechza. We move it up, I'm going to say even further, okay, to 6.5 hours. Right? So that is Rava's explanation to try to explain the Mishnah. Okay, is why we have, so we have a situation where we have normal time for Tamid and Korban Pesach. Okay, then we have a time, okay, another time, right, which we said, okay, is when it's on Erev Shabbos. Okay, okay. So the Tamid has its usual time. So the Tamid, in a sense, therefore has 3 times. One, its normal time, one on Erev Pesach, and one on when Erev Pesach and Erev Shabbos occur at the same time. Okay? Now, continuing back in our Gemara. Kesiduro bechol, kach siduro b'Shabbat, says Rava. The same way its pattern is arranged on a weekday, so its pattern is arranged on Shabbos. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Okay? So this is now the view of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva Omer, says Rabbi Akiva, Kesiduro be'erev Pesach, my kama. Okay, when you say it's according to its arrangement on Erev Pesach, what are we saying here? Okay, so in other words, are we getting into more of a detail that the Pesach is done, okay, in a different manner, or a different order, let's say rather. Amar Abai. So Abai tries to give his answer. Hachi ka'amar. This is what they mean to say between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Kesiduro b'chol, when we say the arrangement that is done on the weekday, be'erev Pesach, that's when it's the eve of Pesach. Kach siduro b'Shabbat be'erev Pesach. So likewise, its arrangement when Shabbat is such that Erev Pesach falls on, when the 14th falls on Erev Pesach, on Shabbos as well. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. That's the view of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva Omer. Rabbi Akiva is going to disagree. He's going to say, Kesiduro be'erev Pesach, shechol liot be'erev Shabbat. Given the arrangement when Erev Pesach comes out on Friday, okay, afternoon, kach siduro b'Shabbat. That's how its arrangement is going to be also when it comes out on a Saturday, the 14th, okay, on a Shabbos. Umatnitin, and our Mishnah de Katani, bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbat, Rabbi Yishmael he. And the language of our Mishnah, saying that it's the same whether it's like a weekday or like a Shabbos, implies that the editor or author of our Mishnah was Rabbi Yishmael. B'mai kamiflage. So what then are Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva arguing about? B'musafin kodmin levizichin kamiflage. They're arguing about the issue of whether the additional offerings are to be brought before the, let's call it the spoons or the containers of incense that go along with the showbread. In other words, when are these to be offered? Okay, that's what they're arguing about. Namely, Rabbi Yishmael Savar, Rabbi Yishmael's of the view, Musafin Kodmin Levizichin, that the additional offerings come before the incense offerings of the showbread. Avad laho lemusafin b'sheish, excuse me, that they do these additional offerings at the 6th hour, uvizichin b'sheva, and the incense of the showbread at the 7th hour, va'avid leila tamid b'sheva umechza, and then they do the tamid at 7.5 hours. Okay, thinking that nothing is done normally after the evening tamid. Rabbi Akiva Savar, Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion, right? Bezichin kodmin lemusafin, that the incense for the showbread is done before these additional offerings. Bezichin bechamesh, that the incense is done at the 5th hour. Umusafin b'sheish, and the additional offerings, right, on Shabbat are done at the 6th hour. Va'avid leila tamid b'sheish umechza, and then they do the tamid at 6.5 hours. Now, mat kifla Rava. Rava challenges Abaye in regards to his interpretation of the machloket of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. And this is what he says. Midei Rabbi Akiva, kisidro be'erev haPesach, shechaliot be'erev Shabbat katani? Are you indicating that the arrangement of Rabbi Akiva is such that when Erev Shabbos, Erev Pesach, falls on Erev Shabbos on Friday, that's what he's teaching? Kisidro be'erev haPesach stama katani. No, argues Rava, that Rabbi Akiva is arguing that the arrangement, okay, of the Erev Pesach and Tamid, when Erev Pesach comes out on Friday afternoon, is really the same as when it's normally coming out. In other words, just like in a weekday. Ela amar Rava. But rather Rava is saying, Hachi ka'amar. This is what it means to tell us. Kesidro bechol, the way it's arranged on a weekday. Da'alma, in general. Kach sidro b'Shabbat be'erev haPesach. So likewise, its arrangement, okay, on Shabbat, when it is Erev Pesach. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. That's the view of the words of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva Omer. But Rabbi Akiva is saying, Kisidro be'erev Pesach, that its arrangement on Erev Pesach, Umat Nitin, and our Mishnah de Katani teaches us, excuse me, Bein Bechol, Bein B'Shabbat, regardless of if it's weekday or on Shabbos, Rabbi Akiva he, that's the view of our Mishnah then is like Rabbi Akiva, okay? That Erev Pesach on a Friday afternoon would be no different than a weekday. B'mai kamiflige. So what then are they arguing about? B'michmar b'sara kamiflige. They're arguing about the potential of the meat to get warm and to begin to spoil before it's actually roasted. Okay? The Korban Pesach. Rabbi Yishmael Savar, Chai Shinan LaMichmar Bisra. Rabbi Yishmael is concerned that this meat might warm and then they begin to spoil before there's time to roast it for Korban Pesach. The Rabbi Akiva Savar, Lo chayshinan lemichmar bisra. And Rabbi Akiva seems to be of the opinion that one doesn't have to question, be suspect that the meat is going to warm up. Okay?
I have a question.
Yes.
I thought the Korban Pesach, they shechted it there, but then they wrapped it up and schlepped it home and put it on the spit to eat with the Seder, the actual Korban Pesach. So it doesn't interfere with using the Mizbeach for the Tamid or anything else they wanted, the Musaf, on Shabbos, whatever they want to put on. I don't understand the conflict. The time factor, I understand.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be a problem because they just gotta shecht it, and then they took out the kishkas, put it on the head, wrapped it up in the skin, and they sent it home or somewhere else in Yerushalayim anyway.
Okay. That's a good question, Erwin. Okay. It would seem from here that may not have been the case, though. Right? It would seem from here that the question is, are they doing all the burning, all the roasting there on the Mizbeach? Right? And therefore, if generally we do the tamid beforehand, or do we do right?
Yeah.
And then after the tamid, then you would roast the Korban Pesach to be able to bring it home to eat it.
Yeah. But
okay.
The Mizbeach couldn't handle that kind of volume.
Oh, well, let's see what the Gemara tells us. It's a good question. Okay. I may not have an easy answer.
Okay.
Okay. So let's see what happens. Though maybe the Gemara is going to clarify it. Okay. Anun chet amud beis. Ilo chayshinan. If we're not suspects, says the Gemara, niv day b'sheishu mechza, then let us do it, right, at 6.5 hours. Kasavar, okay, but here we're saying that Rabbi Akiva's got to be of the opinion, musafin kodmin levizichin, that the additional offerings have to be before the showbread. Avid lahola musafin b'sheish, that therefore you would do the additional offerings at 6, uvizichin b'sheva, and the frankincense, the incense for the showbreads at 7. Va'avid le'letamid b'sheva umechza, and then you would do the tamid at 7.5 hours. Okay. Now, if that was the view, okay, then we could see that when our Mishnah said, okay, that the Chal Erev Pesach liot be'erev Shabbos and nishchat b'sheish umechza, it would be as if the Korban Pesach was slaughtered at the same time as these other additional offerings. Okay. So what happens? We have another challenge. Matkifla Rava Bar Ula. He's going to say the following. Midei Kesidro Bechol, the same way it's arranged on a weekday. Kach Sidro B'Shabbat Be'erev HaPesach. So likewise it's arranged, right? Okay, on Shabbat, that is Erev Pesach, Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, but this is a question. Okay, Kesidro Bechol, Kach Sidro B'Shabbat Be'erev HaPesach, Divrei Rabbi Yishmael Katani. Is that the situation that Rabbi Yishmael is teaching? That the same arrangement for weekday is also the arrangement, okay, when Shabbos is Erev Pesach? Kach Sidro B'Shabbat Stama Katani. But it seems to be teaching that its arrangement for Shabbat, okay, is like a normal Shabbat, a regular Shabbat. Ela Amar Rava Bar Ula Hachikatani. But Rava Bar Ula is going to give the following explanation.
Mm.
Kisidro bechol da alma, like its arrangement in a normal weekday, kach sidro b'shabbat da alma. So likewise is its arrangement on a normal Shabbat.
That's not
Divrei
it.
Rabbi Yishmael.
That's
That's the view of Rabbi Yishmael. In other words, it would seem to be, according to Rabbi Bar Ula, that there is no difference between whether it's a weekday or it's Shabbos. Okay? Rabbi Akiva Omer says, Rabbi Akiva kisidro be'erev haPesach da'alma. Its arrangement is like Erev Pesach normally. Kach sidro b'Shabbat da'alma. So therefore its arrangement, okay, on Shabbat. Okay? That's what it's like. Umatnitin de katani. And the fact that our Mishnah teaches Bein b'chol, Bein b'Shabbat, Divrei hakol hui. That regardless of if it's weekday, okay, or Shabbos, that's according to everybody, both of them. Okay? B'mai kemiflage. So what then are they arguing about? The Gezerat nidavot and nidarim kemiflage. That they're arguing about the decree as to when to do additional offerings, voluntary offerings. That's what they're arguing about. Namely, Rabbi Yishmael Savar, Gazrinan Shabbat Atucho, that we make a decree regarding the Shabbos based on what we do normal weekday. For Rabbi Akiva Savar Lo Gazrinan. And Rabbi Akiva holds that we don't make such a decree. So Gemara naturally asks, Ilo Gazrinan, if we don't make such a decree, Ni Avdei Bo B'Sheva, right? B'Sheish V'Mechza. He says, if we don't make such a decree, then perhaps these additional offerings should be done at 6.5 hours. Kasavar, why? Because he's of the opinion, Musafin could mean levizichin, that Rabbi Akiva holds that other additional offerings should be brought before the incense offerings of the showbread. Namely, Musafin b'sheish, uvizichin b'sheva. Okay? That the additional offerings are brought at 6, the incense for showbread at 7. Va'avid leila tamid b'sheva umechza. And then we would carry out the tamid at 7.5 hours. Now, the Gemara wants to bring a challenge. Meitive. But we bring a Braita that tells us the following. Tamid kol hashana kula, that when the tamid is brought throughout the year, karev kihilchato, that it's offered according to its, let's say, halachic routine, namely, nishchat b'shmona umechza, that it's slaughtered at 8.5 hours, v'karev b'teisha umechza, and it's offered on the altar at 9.5 hours.
It doesn't work.
Okay. Ube'erev haPesach, and on the eve of Pesach, what happens? The tamid, I'm going to fit in here, nishchat b'sheva umechza, that it's slaughtered at 7.5 hours, v'karev b'shmona umechza, and it's brought on the altar at 8.5 hours. Now, chal liot b'Shabbat, kichal liot b'shnei b'Shabbat, divrei Rabbi Yishmael, that when the Erev Pesach comes out on Shabbos, it's as if it's no different than it came out on the second day of the week. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. In other words, that it's done the same on Shabbos, okay, according to this Braita, as it's done the weekday. The only different occasion would be if it's Erev Pesach on Erev Shabbos. Now, Rabbi Akiva Omer says, Rabbi Akiva, Kisidro be'erev haPesach. Oh, that it's done, the arrangement done for Erev Pesach. Okay, that's what he says. That it's not that on when it calls on Shabbos, all right, when Erev Pesach falls on Shabbos itself, it's done similar to when Erev Pesach falls on Erev Shabbos. Now, Bishlema la'abaye necha. That seems acceptable according to the view of Abaye. Ela l'Rava kasha. But for Rava, that would be problematic. Amar lach Rava. Rava would then answer and say us, and tell us, Lo tema kichal b'sheni b'Shabbat. Don't say that it's similar to like the second day of the week. Ela ema, but I would say, kasheni b'Shabbat da alma. Okay, but rather like the second day of the week normally. Okay, so again, it doesn't change it, but it gives a clarification. However, the Braita is not happy. The Gemara is not happy and brings another Braita. Meitive will challenge us with the following Braita. Chaliot b'Shabbat. If the, right, Erev Pesach comes out on Shabbos, Kisidro kol hashana kula. Its arrangement is like all the rest of the year. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. That seems to be the view of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kisidro be'erev haPesach da alma. And Rabbi Akiva disagrees and says its arrangement is like Erev Pesach normally. In other words, we only upped the tamid, so to speak, 1 hour earlier and not 2 hours earlier. Okay? Bishlema l'Rava necha. So that would be fine according to Rava. Ela Abaye kasha. But that's problematic according to the view of Abaye. Amar lach Abaye. And Abaye would come back and answer us the following. Lo tema kisidro kol hashana. Don't say it's like its arrangement all the rest of the year. Ela ema, but rather I would say kisidro kol hashanim kulan. Okay? Like all of the other years, the normal years. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. That would be the view of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva Omer, and Rabbi Akiva would say, Kisidro Erev HaPesach, Shechaliot Be'erev Shabbat. That in that case, it has to be, if it comes out Erev Pesach, in that on Shabbat, okay, it has to be similar to when it comes out Erev Pesach on Erev Shabbat, 2 hours earlier. Now, we come to a brand new Braita. Okay? So we've been arguing back and forth, trying to determine, okay, what is the order so far between Korban Tamid and Korban Pesach. Can Korban Pesach go after the Korban Tamid? Or what about other items? Do they all come before the Korban Tamid? And do we therefore include Korban Pesach in those other items or not? So we now get a new Braita. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay. Minayan shelo yehe davar kodem letamid shel shachar. How do we know that there cannot be anything brought on the altar before the morning tamid? Talmud Loma, our pasuk says, "Va'arach aleha ha'olah," that one arranged upon it the burnt offering. My Talmuda, what is it trying to teach us here? Amar Rava, says Rava, ha'oleh, it says a the burnt offering. Oleh rishona. The fact that it says the burnt offering tells us that a burnt offering has to be first, namely the tamid, and nothing before it. So the Braita now continues. Uminayin she'ein davar korev achar tamid shel bein ha'arbayim. And how do we know that there's nothing comes after the evening or the afternoon tamid? Okay. Talmud Lomar, Torah text says, "V'hiktir aleha chalvei hashlamim." Okay, that one offers the various, let's say, fats of the shlamim. Okay, additional offerings, voluntary offerings. My Talmuda, is it teaching us here? Amar Abaye, says Abaye, aleh shlamim, that comes to tell us about these additional offerings. Velo al chaverta shlomim, and not on something that accompanies, I'll say, the shlomim. Right? So that seems to say that there can't be anything after the tamid in the afternoon or accompanying it. It all must be before it. Now the Gemara tells us, Mat kifla Rava. Rava challenges, Ema shlamim hu delo nakriv. Are we going to, I might say then, that the shlamim offerings are not brought then? Ha'olot nakriv. Okay, so fine if you say that you can't bring shlamim, maybe burnt offerings can be brought after the tamid. Ela amar Rava, but says Rava, hashlamim, regarding the shlamim, aleha hashalem kol hakorbanat kulam. Okay, it means the completion of all of the offerings together. That's what he's saying. Now, another Braita. Tanu Rabbanan, says this Braita. Tamid kodem lePesach. Okay, here now we're finally coming back to our discussion that we've had all along. According to this Braita, the tamid comes first,
And then
then the korban Pesach. Pesach kodem leketoret. Okay, and then the Pesach is before the ketoret, the going up of the incense. Ketoret, kodemet leneirot. And the incense, okay, is before the candles. Okay, implying what? Yuchar davar shene'amar bo ba'erev ubein ha'arbayim. The davar shelo ne'amar bo ba'erev ela bein ha'arbayim bilvad. Namely, that it should be put off, I'm going to say. Okay, that where the Torah mentions in regard to that particular korban, the words erev or bein ha'arbayim, that should be put off after something where it does not say erev, but only bein ha'arbayim. Ihachi, says the Gemara. Ketoret v'neirot, nami nikdemu lePesach. If that's the case, says the Gemara, then shouldn't the incense and the candles, all of that, be done before the Korban Pesach? So the Gemara answers, Yuchar davar shene'amar bo ba'erev ubein ha'arbayim, the davar shelo ne'amar bo ela bein ha'arbayim bilvad. Again, it should be put off. That which is citing both evening and afterward, and between the evenings, bein ha'arbayim, okay? After something where it is not said regarding only bein ha'arbayim. So the Gemara wants simply to tell us here, Shani Hatam. It's different there. The mi'et Rachmana, that the Torah actually has Hashem telling us with the word oto, it. The Tanya, as it teaches, may erev va'ad boker, because that could be from the evening, through the morning. Teim la midata shedehe doleket me erev ad boker. Okay, that you put on it, right? Namely, give it onto the altar, something there where its measure extends and it's lit. In other words, it continues to burn from the evening through the morning. Okay, and so we're going to stop right there. We really did not get a total answer to Erwin's question, okay, about where was it that the Pesach was roasted, whether it was done, so to speak, at home or done all in the Beis Hamikdash, okay? But we're going to continue tomorrow and see if the Gemara will perhaps clarify that. Okay? All right?
Well.
Okay. So everybody have a good day. Just a quick reminder that we've got tonight the Men's Club book review as well at 8 o'clock. Okay? Besides, Rabbis in Rotation this morning at